My name is Matthew Monk. I'm here for the Smithsonian National Museum of American History's Woven Coverlet project. Today is June the 30th, 2018. So if I could have you state your name for the camera.
I'm Ron Walter.
All right. So what first got you interested in coverlets, Ron?
Well, actually, my wife and I were having an upcoming wedding, and we were buying things at auction, so we had furniture. And after we got married, we continued to look for things at auctions, and I saw a coverlet and didn't know what it was, so I left a bid on it. And the auctioneer called and said, "You won." And he invited me to the next auction in the town a couple miles from where I lived, and I paid for it and carried it around looking at the stuff at that auction. A woman come up and said, "Do you know where that was woven?" I said, "No." She said it was woven at the Bolton Turkey Farm in Silverdale, which is a mile from where I live. And that piqued my interest in who was this guy and what was he doing. And then that same year, another antique dealer offered me one that said Hilltown on it, which is where I live in Hilltown. And here it turned out that was a weaver who lived 2.5 miles on the other side of us. So in my first two coverlets were Hilltown coverlets, and that I started researching from there.
What is a coverlet?
Well, technically, to me, it's a woven bed covering that usually has a center field, often pattern repeats. It has borders maybe on 3 sides, maybe 4 sides, maybe no borders, but depending. And it often in the German world, Pennsylvania, Ohio, they often have fringe on 1 or 3 sides.
What are the different kinds of coverlets that a weaver could create?
Well, I mean, the first distinction would be geometric or figured and fancy. And then there's also different weave structures within geometrics and different weave structures within fancy. But mostly a multi-shaft loom with anywhere from 2 to 28 treadles. You could do a geometric. And the figured and fancy, they had to have a figured attachment that they attached above their loom that replaced most all the treadles, and it did the weft by weft patterning for the weaver.
What can you tell me about the history of the coverlet and its importance in American history?
What can I tell you? I mean, the earliest ones we know of are dated 1771, overshot coverlets. The big era started in and they were geometric style coverlets, dated overshots, or generally the early ones. In about 1820, there was figured and fancies. James Alexander and a weaver on Long Island that had the reclining cow. And by 1830, there were other figured attachments around, and people were weaving them in a lot of different places.
And so why do you think they're important in the story of America?
Well, to me, it's part of the history. I had no interest in history till I found out something local, something that seemed to interest me. And it's a history of technology and actually, I guess, home life, things that people saw that were important to add to their home.
Do you have a favorite coverlet or a favorite coverlet weaver?
Well, my second coverlet was Samuel B Muscleman, and he was the premier Bucks County, Pennsylvania weaver, and he's one of my favorites. I have a lot of favorites, but I would say he's my longest favorite coverlet weaver.
Why is Samuel Muscleman your favorite?
Well, he numbered his coverlets. I've seen him numbered as high as 768 or 85, and then he stopped numbering his last years. But and he did a lot of different borders and center fields, and he was into a lot of interesting stuff.
What can you tell me about the different technology that coverlet weavers used to make the figured and fancy coverlets?
Well, there's not a lot of information available. Horace Baker was the earliest patent that I know got passed around, and John Schulter used the Horace Baker patent. We know that, and started weaving in Pennsylvania in 1830, and Baker was New York, and Schulter wove a double weave. He was weaving double weave, which isn't a very often used structure for fancy coverlets in Pennsylvania. And then Conger and Dietrich had a patent, and theirs was a peg-controlled figure fancy. And then the Miley and Mellinger crowd, they had another patent in 1834, I believe, was the first one, and William Low-Miller used that. He has one of their attachments, and that's available with cards that you can see out at the Muncie Historical Society. At least that's where it used to be. I think it's still there.
Can you tell me a little bit about what the Coverlet College is here at the National Museum of the American Coverlet?
Well, the Coverlet College is a weekend that we spend. We started out with a basic day and a more advanced day, but it's sort of evolved now to just 2 days, and then everybody wanted to shorten the second day, so we have Friday evening, Saturday, and Sunday. We have about 14 presentations. We get people from around the country that volunteer their time and come and present interesting topics, and it's a good fundraiser for the museum, and it's a good place to meet other people interested in coverlets.
What can you tell me about the Colonial Coverlet Guild?
Well, the Colonial Coverlet Guild is a group that started, I believe, about the 1920s in the Chicago area, and it's going more national, though most members are from the East and Midwest, and it's a small group, and they have a quarterly newsletter, which I happen to be newsletter editor, and then I inherited the presidency. So I'm both president and newsletter editor, and we need members. So anybody interested, please consider joining.
So tell me a little bit about the scholarship you've conducted into coverlet history and different weaver histories, and what you're working on now.
Well, my goal was to try to record examples of coverlets done by any weaver in the United States, and I find and save images in what I call my Coverlet Gallery. So I have a gallery of coverlets by figured and fancy by state, by weaver, and then by not signed ones, fancy ones, and I have another gallery by geometric weave structure, and then it also has borders and trademarks and center fields for fancy coverlets. So I'm just trying to document all the different types of coverlets.
So what are some of the ways that coverlet weavers would have marketed their product to their customers?
Well, I think a lot of it was word of mouth in the community, but they also, some of them would in their ads, they talk about you can drop off your yarns. If you did wool, dyed wool, you can drop off. He tells you how much to drop off for a coverlet, and at some drop-off point, usually a store or someplace in the community, and then he'd get the order, and he'll make the coverlet and go back, send it back to them. But mostly they have to see some examples, so he must have been able to show them, and I think a lot of it's word of mouth.
In what ways, well, how did coverlet weavers acquire their patterns and their technology?
That's a hard one. My theory is that they probably, when they bought a fancy and figured attachment, that they got some patterning information. I don't know whether it was a point paper where they actually got punch cards, if it was punch cards, but there's very little information around. You don't see much. I have seen a couple weavers' drawings, point papers, or some available, but nowhere near as much. And some of them talk about having the latest from New York or whatever patterns available, but it's hard. I think the best weavers were able to get a start, and then they would do their own patterns, and some of them changed every year.
What kinds of design sources did these weavers use, do you think? Do you think they were using what kind of different sources?
I don't know. I mean, some of them are amazing because there's coverlets with harbor scenes and all different kind of ships. There's coverlets with, in the old days, they called Christian heathen, which I don't think is proper term now, but there's Eastern type buildings and federal United States type building in contrast, and there's a coverlet woven with the first New York Stock Exchange on it. There's coverlets woven with exotic animals like leopards and giraffes and lizards, and they found pictures or somehow in books and made patterns and borders out of that.
How many states have you found evidence of coverlet weaving?
Off the top of the head, I don't know. I mean, New York, New Jersey, Northern Maryland, Pennsylvania, Ohio, a little one in Tennessee, a couple in Kentucky, a couple in Kansas, Michigan had some, Indiana, Illinois. I'm sure I missed a couple, but not a whole lot of them.
And what ways did these coverlet weavers arrange business-wise? What were some of the different options that coverlet weavers would have to set up shop?
Well, I think some of them either wove in their house or had a weaving shed next to the house, behind the house. When they had the figured and fancy, they generally needed, that was mounted on a floor above their old loom. They could just modify their old loom. Some of them would actually get a larger loom and weave full width, but they're not as common. And full width woven doesn't mean it was later. They were woven pretty early, very early actually. And other ones would have a shop in a town and had access to people through the town, and some of them had mills. Some mills had weavers that would weave coverlets for you.
Where did coverlet weavers get their raw materials?
I think a lot of them could buy the cotton was often used in the warp, and they could buy that pretty readily, and they would supply it for a fee. And then the wool, often the home could be done in the home, spun, and they would tell them how to spin it according to how many pounds per knot or whatever, and so the people could supply wool. They could supply dyed wool, or the weaver could supply all the wool and the cotton needed, and he would dye it to the colors they wanted.
I think that's it, Ron.
Oh.
That was my last question. See?
Got off easy. Of course, some of the questions are hard to answer on the fly.
Yes. Well, this is Matthew Monk for the National Woven Coverlet Project at the National Museum of American History. Again, today is Saturday, June the 30th, 2018.